Welcome back to Custom Hose University. Today, I'm going to show you my step-by-step process of how I build a hydraulic hose. So I have this hydraulic hose here. I'm going to assume that you've already identified the ends since that's what most of the course was based off of. And I'm going to show you how to actually identify and make the hose and crimp it. So first up, I'm going to get a measurement on the hose. When I measure, I want to make sure that my nut is fully extended, and I'll show you on the next hose why that is really important. So first off, I'm going to measure this hose. This measurement is coming out to 45 inches. So now I want you to stop what you're doing, and I want you to write your measurement down on a piece of paper. So I write my 45 inches there. This is important because I've trained people in, and when they try to make a hose, they try to remember everything in their head, and that's a really good way to make a mistake. You don't want to make any mistakes here. So now I have my measurement down on my notepad. Next, I'm going to go and look at the lay line on my hose, which we have gone over in the hose section of the course. On this hose, I can see that it's a 1-inch ID, 6,000 PSI. Right when I see that, I know off the top of my head that this is going to be my multi-spiral 1-inch 6,000 PSI hose. So now I'm going to write down the corresponding part number for the hose. That's just so I don't forget which hose that I'm using when I make this hose. The next step would be to identify your fittings, which we already went over extensively. I know that this is female JIC 16, and it's the same on both ends. So I'm going to write down the quantity and then my part number. Now I have all the information written down on my piece of note paper so that I can build this hose properly. Next, I'm going to show you why it's important to measure with the nuts out on some O-ring face fittings. In the chapter on O-ring face, remember I mentioned that O-ring face can have a loose neck or a stiff neck. This is why it's important to measure with the nut out. Different manufacturers can have different size nuts, so that can change the length of your hose by half to a whole inch depending on who's making the hose. So this is when it becomes important to measure with the nuts out. Different manufacturers will have different length nuts, different length ferrules, stems, and that's why we don't measure the chunk of hose between the fittings, because this isn't always going to be the same length on every manufacturer's fitting. So this one, I'm going to measure with the nut out, and then the way that we measure in this industry is we're going to measure at the center of the angle. So at the center of this 45 degree. If this was a 90 degree, I do the same thing where I measure in the center. So now I'm going to measure it. I have my nut out. So we're going to measure to the face of this 45 right in the center, which you can see here is 34 inches. Next up, we're going to actually build a hose from start to finish. So let's say this is the hose that you're building. First step, I'm going to measure the hose. So this is actually the same fitting as the last one, but this is a stiff neck. So the O-ring face, like I said, there's the stiff and loose neck long collar ones. So this one, I'm going to pull the nut out as far as I can, and then I'm going to measure to the center of my 90 degree fitting. So now we're going to measure it. I'm measuring it, and it's coming out to 27.5 inches. So remember, first step, I got to write down my length. Next, we want to identify which hose we're using. On this hose, I can see that there's a lot of identifying factors to figure out what it is. When we went over the hose chapter, I mentioned R16. As you can see here on the hose, it says R16 right on it, so I know what hose I'm going to have to use. So the hose that I carry here is a 3,000 PSI hose, 4,000 PSI hose, or a super high pressure, it's 4625 PSI hose. In this instance, my customer asked me to make it out of super high pressure because he's been having issues with this hose blowing. So I decided that I'm going to use the 4,625 PSI hose. When I look at this hose, it doesn't say anything on it for the size of the hose, But if I cut the hose and measure the ID of it, I'll be able to figure out what size hose this is. Now, this one's not crimped, so I'm just going to pull the fitting off, grab my caliper, and I measure the inside of the hose. It's coming out to 0.75, so I can safely say that this is a 3/4 inch hose. So I know what type of hose I'm going to use. I write that down. Next, we identify the fittings. Like I said earlier, we already went over this in great detail during the course. So this one I know is number 12, female O-ring face. And this is the same thing, but just a 90. So I'll write those two fittings down. And then when you have an angled fitting on your hose, you really want to make sure that you get the angle of the fitting on the hose correct. So if I'm installing this hose and this 90 is pointing the opposite direction, I'm going to have to bend this hose and it's going to be installed in an improper way and put a lot of strain on the hose. So when I look at this, I want to go with the natural curl of the hose because I want it to sit in as well as possible. So when I'm looking at this, I think I have a clock right in front of me. 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. I can see that this fitting is at 9 o'clock. It'd be the same thing if it was pointed this way or this way. So this one just happens to be at 9 o'clock. So I'm going to write that down next to my angled fitting because this is very important. So the natural curl of the hose, you see it wants to curl this way. So that's how I'm going to figure out the angle. So I have this chunk of hose here that I know is going to be long enough to make this hose, and I have my fittings. It's going to be very important to measure how far down your fitting is going to sit on your hose. This is important because if this line is showing after I crimp the hose, it tells me that the fitting isn't on the hose enough, and there's a good chance that that fitting might blow off. So when I do that, on this fitting, I can see where the angle starts to bevel down towards this line that's on it. In the middle of that is about where the hose is going to sit. So then I'm going to mark the hose. I can see here, I'm about halfway down that slope. I'm going to mark the hose. I have a nice thick white line on it so that I can't miss it. Next, I'm going to grease up the inside of the hose and put my fitting on. Now put the fitting on. And you can see that my line is at the very bottom of the fitting. Now, if I put it on and it was like this and I went to crimp it, that fitting is going to blow off. So you want to make sure that you cover that line up with your fitting. Now I go back and look at my notes and I see this hose is 27.5 inches. So I'm going to go to 0. Keep that at 0. Use my fitting. I'm going to measure 27.5 inches to the middle of the 90. Same thing we just did. About halfway where the angle starts going down, that's where the hose is going to sit. So I need to mark it there. That's going to ensure that my hose ends up being 27.5 inches overall. So now I got my line here. I'm going to cut my hose. Now at my shop, I have a specialty hose saw, but really you can use a chop saw or any saw that's going to give you a nice clean cut. I wouldn't use like a hacksaw or something because then you're going to mangle the hose. So use a good saw. So now I'm going to cut the hose, line my line up, and cut. This is garbage. So next, I'm going to clean this hose out. It's very important to clean it out because you don't want any of the particles that were made from cutting the hose to get into your system. It could damage or ruin your system. So what I do is I use carb spray. I spray it out. And then you could stop there. We don't at our hose shop. We have a special tool that shoots pellets through the hose just to make sure it's really clean. So I'll go shoot one through this really quick. shoot this through. So this is the pellet that I shot through the hose. As you can see, there's not too much dirt on it, but there is a little bit. So the carb spray did get it pretty clean. This just makes sure that the hose is completely clean and there's no contamination. Now that I'm done with that, I'm going to take my other fitting. I'm going to mark the depth that my fitting will go on the hose. I'm going to grease the hose up. I'm going to put my fitting on. Make sure I bury my line. And this is when the orientation matters now. So now I want to point this fitting with the natural curl of the hose to 9 o'clock, just like my other hose was. Just imagine there's a clock in front of you, 9 o'clock. Perfect. So now before I crimp this hose, there's a few aspects I want to go over to make sure that you're not just crimping random fittings on random hose. So these fittings that I have are made specifically for this hose. Since this is a braided hose, I'm not going to use these fittings on a multi-spiral hose. If I have a multi-spiral hose, I'm not going to use the same fittings that I would use on this braided hose. They're different series fittings. They're going to be called different things depending on the manufacturer. And then every manufacturer is going to have different series fittings for every different type of hose that they make. It's just something you need to be cognizant of when you're making the hoses. There's a ton of different crimpers out there, and I'm not sure which one you have, but I do have 2 different crimpers here that I can show you how to use. So the first crimper that I'm going to crimp is on a Parker crimper. It's a very common crimper across the world. The Parker crimper is going to have a set of dies, which I actually have right here. If we take a look in them, they have this ledge here that your fitting is going to sit on. You want to make sure that the bottom of the fitting is on the ledge. If it's above or below, then you're going to mess up your crimp and your hose is going to be garbage. So this die set for the Parker crimper has a ledge that your fitting needs to sit on. When I'm using this fitting, I can feel when it hits the ledge. If I have it too far down, I'm going to smash the bottom of this fitting and it's going to be ruined. If I'm too high up, I'm going to crimp too far down on the crimp shell and it's going to be messed up and be garbage. So you want to make sure that you're setting that right on the ledge, which I will show you how that feels when I use that crimper next. All right, so when I'm crimping this fitting, I want to make sure that I'm using the proper dies and using the proper crimp spec. Since this is a braided hose and I know what series fittings I use, I can reference this chart to get my crimp spec and my dies. So I got my series fittings down to 3/4. That's how I figured out I needed these green dies. Now on my chart, my crimp spec range is from 1.245 inches to 1.265 inches. Now the perfect crimp spec to get here would be 1.255. But if you fall in that range, your fitting is crimped into spec and you're good to go. If it's over crimped, there's a good chance that this fitting will crack and then you'll have a leaking hose. If it's under crimped, there's a good chance that this fitting will just fly off completely. When you're dealing with over 4,000 PSI pressure, it can be very dangerous. So now I got my dies in my crimper. I'm going to put them in. On this Parker crimper, I have to release my ring. Turn it on. And then I'm going to put my fitting in the hole. Make sure those dies are evenly spaced. Put my other half in. And like I talked about earlier, I'm going to find that ledge. So there I'm on the ledge. I'm going to crimp it down. That's what my crimp's gonna look like. Looks nice. Now this is the most important step of this entire process. I'm gonna take my caliper and I wanna measure my crimp spec to make sure it's in spec. And 1.255, perfect. Next, I'm going to show you my fancy crimper that's way easier to use than this. One more thing that I want to mention about the crimper that we just used is that is for Parker fittings or Parker interchange fittings only. You can't be crimping, let's say, a Gates fitting in that crimper because those dies aren't made for it. Now, next, I'm going to be using my digital crimper. This crimper is really nice because as long as I have a crimp spec, I can crimp any fitting on the planet. So what we just did in the last step is we came up with the 1.255 crimp spec. And on this one, I just input that spec. It's going to tell me what size dies I want to use. So it's telling me that I want to use the 32 dies. So I'm going to turn it on, do a quick change. And that's how quick it is to change those dies. Next, I'm going to crimp this fitting. This fitting, there's a line at the top. On this fitting, I'm going to want to line this line up flush with the front of my dies. So, I'm going to crimp this fitting. And as you can see now, I'm crimped right up to that line. Done crimping. Most important part, got to measure that crimp spec. This one's sitting at 1.250, which is in the range, so we're good. All right, guys, that does it for the crimping. As you can see on my hose, I can't see any white lines. That means that my fittings are pushed all the way on. I'm not going to have any issues. They're in spec. This hose should be good to go and get the customer or your machine back up and running. So just to recap a little bit, when I'm measuring a hose, I want to measure with the nuts out. And if I'm measuring an angle, I want to measure the center of the angle. Remember, after you measure, write down the measurement that you had right away so you don't forget. Sometimes half an inch or an inch off on a hose can mean all the difference, and that hose isn't going to work. So after you write down the length of your hose, you're going to go to your lay line and you're going to figure out which hose you're using. Once you figure that out, you're going to move on to the fittings, figure out what fittings you need, write those part numbers down, and then you're going to build the hose. Remember, after every crimp, you need to make sure you check the crimp spec because you don't want to send a hose out or use a hose that is not in spec and could hurt somebody. So now that I've shown you how to do this, you're ready to go on your own.